Welcome, everybody, to the Psychology Is podcast. I'm Nick Fortino, and I get to be joined today by Dr. Stephanie Williams. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Dr. Williams is a therapist and a forensic psychologist, and we are here today to talk about overcoming anxiety and depression. And so maybe we can start, though. I'd love to hear you explain to us, what does it mean to be a forensic psychologist?
Well, that's just a really, really fancy way to say that I help the courts understand mental health as it applies to the law. And so when people are unfit or unfit to stand trial or incompetent, or they are labeled as a mentally disordered offender or not guilty by reason of insanity, that's where forensic psychologists come in to help the court decide if it's true or not, right? Because people malinger. And then to also help the courts understand treatment possibilities and potential outcomes for the defendant or the person facing charges if they have a mental illness.
And what you just said is very interesting, because people malinger, and people listening may or may not know that that basically means to act as if you have a mental disorder when you really don't.
Right.
And people can get away with that because mental disorders are diagnosed based on behavior, not necessarily brain scans or blood tests or things like that. So many people do get away with this. So that's very interesting to me that you are kind of in a position to have to discern whether someone is kind of authentically mentally disordered. So can you tell me more about that? Like, how do you make that discernment?
Well, actually, we use a lot of objective measures. And so it's not me going in with my judgment. I'm sure you're familiar that research suggests that, just pure clinical judgment or a person's intuition is not effective in identifying like things like risk and whether someone is malingering or not. But there are numerous tools that we use to assess if someone is malingering psychiatric symptoms or memory problems, or if their response style in general suggests that they tend to over exaggerate or under report different types of symptoms.
What's one example of one of those tools that you use?
The SIRS is one that we use pretty regularly, and that is to identify if someone is malingering psychiatric symptoms. And so it just looks at things that are mostly uncommon in reporting of like someone who may have schizophrenia, and then just how that person responds to those types of questions, is backed by research that says statistically that person is likely exaggerating, and, confidence intervals and things like that help support that.
And then, this may be obvious to some people listening, but not everyone may know that the reason people might do this in a court case is because the sentencing is very different if you are considered to be mentally disordered than if you're not. So can you explain, for example, what might be the difference in someone's legal destiny if they do or don't have a mental disorder after committing a crime?
Absolutely. So if someone is identified as mentally ill during the crime or before the court case, there are two different avenues that it could go. You're essentially sent to a state hospital. And if you are found unfit to stand trial, then we're trying to get you to fitness, and we're trying to make you competent to stand trial. And so that's a reduction of your symptoms, that's awareness of the legal proceedings, that's helping you be able to engage in the legal process fully by helping your lawyer create a strong defense for you. On the other end, if you were mentally ill at the time of the crime, you go to a state hospital for your sentence. And so instead of going to prison for 25 years to life for a murder, you would go to a state hospital until they deemed you safe to be back in the community. And so a lot of people think that if you were to malinger, right, you're like, I want to go to a state hospital because eventually they'll see that I am, stable and healthy and I can regain society and I've served my time essentially. But, a lot of research has shown that it is actually the reverse.
Mm.
People, assessing for judgment and assessing for, mental stability and safety in the community have a higher burden to prove. And so, even though you don't want someone who's mentally ill going to, prison for a crime that they committed, that they didn't have control over their, bodily functions, or, were suffering from delusions, there's a steep price to pay going to the state hospital as
Mm. Yeah. And just to put it on people's radar, one of the really kind of landmark studies that relates to what you're talking about, regarding kind of demonstrating your normalcy in a psychiatric ward or setting like that, is called On Being Sane in Insane Places,
well. Mhm.
where a bunch of faculty from Stanford in the 70s, reported symptoms that might sound like schizophrenia, and they were admitted to a mental hospital. And yeah, basically the big conclusion was that no one ever really detected that they were stable, lucid, normal people. And they
Yeah,
were, they were,
except for the other psychiatric patients. They
that's
knew
interesting.
that
I
they
didn't know
were,
that detail.
yeah, they knew that they were malingering. So that study has been done multiple times. And it's funny that the psychiatric patients knew that they were lying or faking it, but the doctors
Interesting.
did not, because right, if I have to put my license on the line to ensure that you are safe, then that's a steep burden to
Mm,
climb. And also, when we think about reviewing documentation, there is also a lopsided thing that happens when we are, basing our opinions off documentation and history review that kind of like pulls into the recency effect and all of those
mm,
other issues. And so, yeah, it's
mm.
pretty interesting.
I did not know that the psychiatric patients detected their normalcy. That's actually quite fascinating.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. I mean, I think that when you think about in and out groups, people are really good at understanding or identifying who's in the group and
Mm.
who's out of the group.
Right.
And when you are kind of on for people who are out of the group, you are discounting that people who are in the group watch you when you're off. And so
Mm.
that is a really big factor in like human dynamics in general, right? And so I've worked in numerous psychiatric facilities where patients would be like, no, this person is not right. And, or
Mm.
they would be immensely fearful of that patient because they were essentially antisocial and were lingering to be in a less restrictive, setting.
Mm. How fascinating.
Yes, it is.
Wow. Yeah.
It's
And
pretty.
so what might be the difference? Like, I'm thinking of a famous case that you're probably aware of, and other people are probably too, of the guy that the movie Split was based off of, Billy Milligan, who committed these crimes. He sexually assaulted four different women, and in court, claimed that it was his dissociative identity disorder that kind of, or it was one of his alternate personalities that
Mhm,
committed those crimes. And so he was seen to be mentally ill and did much less time in a mental hospital than he would have done in prison.
mhm.
Um, so I guess that's the incentive, despite
Yeah.
what we just talked about, the
Mhm,
likelihood of how much time you'll do in a mental hospital is probably going to be less than you would do in prison if it's a serious crime.
mhm. That's absolutely true. So the whole thing about malingering is that there is something to be gained, right?
Right.
And so, malingering could look like you exaggerating, symptoms for disability income, exaggerating symptoms for military benefits. I mean,
Mm,
it runs the gamut. And so,
yeah.
yeah,
Even
absolutely.
even drug prescriptions, some people want certain
Yes.
drugs.
Yep.
Interesting. Okay. Well, that's fascinating work. So what what's the split of your time in terms of your work as a therapist and as a forensic psychologist?
It's about 50-50.
Yeah.
And so on the clinical side, I specialize in treating women of color
Mm,
who are experiencing depression and anxiety.
mm,
Um, and so that is 50% of my practice, where I see clients individually or in group settings. And then I also do some psychological assessments.
mm.
So that's part of my clinical side as well.
Yes. Have you been doing all your therapy online lately?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Of course, right?
Yes, because of COVID, but
Yeah.
actually it has made uh, resources for, achieving like mental wellness easier. There's an easier access. And so I'm giving people who are in more remote areas where there may not be a lot of therapists of color or therapists who specialize in treating people of color. And so I get people all throughout the state now, which is something that I think is really great since we've had to move to telehealth services.
Mm,
It opens up the world for most people.
mm. Yeah, that I was going to ask you that question. Like, what unique benefits have come from the shift to telehealth services? And that's a great answer, is just accessibility to a better match. Um, yeah, beautiful. Are there any shortcomings that you're finding with telehealth services?
There are. I think that for a lot of mothers, the getting out of the home and having a space to yourself is really beneficial and therapeutic within itself, right? And so having to be vulnerable and deal with a lot of the issues in the setting that is causing those issues is really difficult for a lot of the patients that I work with.
Mm,
Also, I work with a lot of teenagers, and although parents like to believe that, it's the kid, a lot of times it's it may be the kid, but it's also the parenting, right? And it may not work for the temperament of the child. And so sometimes getting that teenager out of the home, to a place where they can just, decompress, be away from the parents, even for 45 minutes to an hour, and have that breathing room is really helpful. And so there are pluses and minuses.
right.
I do get a lot of people who go for walks to the park to do their sessions so that they can have that separation, or people who sometimes just meet in their car. But,
Yeah,
you know, I joke with a lot of mothers about that 10 minutes before you get into the house and you're waiting, in your garage or in front of your house, where you just like, at least I get these 5 or 10 minutes to myself, right? So, yeah, those are some of the downsides to
mm.
being all telehealth.
When things, when we move beyond the COVID pandemic, do you think you'll do a little bit of both? Do you have a sense of that?
Yes. So some of my clients are in really remote areas and wouldn't be able to make it to my office. And so for them, I will continue. But for clients who do want to meet in person, I do understand that human contact,
Hmm.
especially with the pandemic and everyone being really isolated. People who are single, or people who, are single parents, or even, married couples and families, you kind of want to see other people sometimes. And
Right.
so, opening it back up is definitely something that I want to do.
Mm. So when it comes to overcoming anxiety, overcoming depression, my sense is that there are some strategies that might be fairly universal that will kind of be effective for everybody, men, women, and people of all different colors and classes and every difference possible. And then, of course, there will be many strategies that are much more uniquely tailored to specific individuals because, of course, specific types of individuals face different challenges in the world. And so I'm curious if you might kind of have anything come to mind, whether it relates to anxiety or depression, that you find are kind of universal, that work for almost everybody, and then some that you find to be uniquely tailored to certain groups of people.
Absolutely. And so generally the first thing when someone comes into my office and says that they're suffering from depression or anxiety, I am aware that there are a lot of medical mirrors to mental illness. And so I first want to just make sure that they've seen a doctor within the last year, that there's nothing wrong with their thyroid or any other, diabetes. All these things can mirror depression and anxiety. And so
Mm,
that's the first one across the board. Everyone should be, going to their primary care physician regularly and getting checked out. And then when I think about anxiety separately, I also want to assess for if this is related to any trauma response. I think this is something that people often overlook, and they only notice the anxious response and don't understand if it's related to a trigger or a trauma. And so I do a thorough assessment of that. And I want people to be aware of that because treating the anxiety alone without treating the trauma is kind of like putting a band-aid,
mm,
on a gaping wound that needs
mm.
stitches. And so I do a lot of assessment. But generally, some of the things that I think really work for both are a lot of grounding techniques.
A lot of
So
grounding techniques, you said?
yeah, yes,
Mm,
grounding techniques. And so there are an array of them available online that you can look up. But taking time to ground yourself and recognize your overall bodily response to being grounded and present is really helpful. Meditative practices are really helpful with anxiety and depression, and reducing some of the distress that you feel.
mm.
And
What's one, not to interrupt you, but I'm just curious, what's one of your personal favorite or most effective grounding techniques for
oh, my
yourself?
one of my favorite ones is the noticing five, using your five senses
Mm,
and picking out different things in the room and being aware of those things. And that is something that you can do fairly, where people aren't able to notice that you're doing it, right? And
mm,
so I can sit in a chair and really be here with you and talking, but then I'm present that I am seeing, you are sitting behind a screen and I feel cool air and I feel the pressure of my chair and, all the other senses and just grounding myself in the
mm,
present when I am becoming distressed.
mm,
So another technique that I often implore people to use is the stop technique, which is when you're ruminating about something. Um, this is more of a brain exercise where you tell yourself to stop thinking about something. And I usually ask people to practice it, saying it out loud first. And so if you're worrying about something and you go down that rabbit hole of like worrying about what if I'm in a car accident and then what will happen to my family? And then, right. And so you're going down this rabbit hole. I tell people to give themselves two or three um, worries and then to stop. And as they continue to become more skillful in that, then it's one worry. And then it's identifying the worry and stopping or using a worry tree, right? Is this something that I can do anything about? And that could be yes or no. If it is yes, then you've exhausted all that you could do to help that situation, then
mm,
that's where you stop. And if it's not, if it's something completely outside of your control, then you should stop worrying about it
mm,
because it's nothing you can, and that is only, distressing you more. And so these really useful, quick layman's tools that you can do on your own and you can research are really helpful.
mm. And it's, I think the combination of things you've just described perhaps is what works best. Like we can do those thought processes and stop our worries best when we're feeling grounded. It's like those grounding exercises can take the edge off of our distress or anxiety just enough to be clear-headed enough to kind of get a handle on our thoughts. And I just want to highlight what you said too about worrying. And I've heard it be put one way, which is pretty much what you said, but it's like, do you have a problem? Yes or no? And if the answer is yes, the next question is, can you do anything about it? And if the answer is yes to that, then the answer is, well, then why worry? And if the answer is no, I can't do anything about it, then again, the conclusion is, then why worry?
Yeah.
And so it's like when you really like, did you call it the worry tree? Is that what you
Yeah.
said? Yeah,
Yeah.
that maybe this is kind of
Yeah.
what you mean by that. And ultimately it always leads to worrying is actually quite pointless.
Yeah.
And I've heard people defend worrying in interesting ways where they make some valid points by saying, well, maybe, when you worry about something, you're actually kind of foreseeing a real potential threat and you can kind of prevent it from happening. But that's not quite what we mean by this sort of excessive, repetitive worry. It's one thing to foresee danger
Mhm.
and act accordingly and prevent it. And it's another thing to just let your mind spiral out of control with every possible bad thing that could happen.
Right.
It's a
Right.
fine
And
line.
I would argue that if someone believes that they are preventing danger, is that a trauma response? And
Mm,
what? Because why do you need to live your life trying to prevent danger in that way?
mm,
And so then examining what that means for that person and what traumatic response did they not prepare themselves for that occurred that they now feel like they need to plan and worry for all traumatic experiences in the future.
mm,
And so I definitely like to debate this, on a cognitive level with clients, but sometimes it is more of just the physical response of what it feels like to be in that worry. And is that comfortable for you?
mm,
And if it is, then what's comfortable about that feeling? And if it's not, then why do we continue to do it? Because our body is not made to live in that kind of like fight or flight mode consistently for long periods of time. And
right.
so it's really harmful to us to continue to live like that.
Mm, it's a great point. Yeah, and it's interesting because if I think we forget the vast majority of times that we worried about things that never came to fruition. And if we didn't forget how many thousands of times that happened, we might not take our mind so seriously when it's
Hmm.
generating a bunch of worries. But it's like
Absolutely.
we have this bias toward thinking that there's actually some validity to these
Hmm.
worries. But
Hmm.
if we like had all the data in mind of again how many times we worried unnecessarily, we would see more clearly that it's not helpful.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Absolutely.
And what you're saying about trauma, just yeah, I think that can't be emphasized enough. And so I want to make sure we continue on to the question of those more uniquely tailored approaches to
Mhm.
overcoming things like this. But I want to investigate trauma a little bit more. And so when you meet with someone and you find that indeed there is trauma in their past, there's unhealed wounds,
Mhm.
what what do you do to work with that trauma?
Mhm. Um, well, first, I want to assess how strongly they experience this trauma because that really guides how the pace and the depth that we go.
Mm,
Because you don't want to expose a person to trauma, to being re traumatized if they're
right.
not ready. And so there are tons of techniques that are used, like EMDR, brain spotting, and some other techniques that help reduce someone's trauma response.
Mm,
Um, Also, I think I want to assess that they are not in a situation that is re-traumatizing, consistently re-traumatizing. And so one thing that comes up for me is, the Black Lives Matter movement and how a lot of Black Americans have just been re-traumatized by all these videos of death. And so then is it really effective to deal with that trauma, or am I just trying to help them to cope? And so, because if you're going to continually be re traumatized, then that is not really helpful. And so that also applies to people who are in domestic violence, situations and things like that, where it's like we need to really worry about safety and coping, and then we can deal with the trauma later.
Mm, great point. And yeah, what you said too about pace and depth,
Mhm.
pace at which you kind of enter into that trauma and the depth that you reach, that's those are important principles. And I never heard anyone quite put it like that, but that's a great way to think of it, because I could imagine the disaster that you could create if you were to go way too fast and way too deep
Mhm.
into someone's trauma. Just how skillful, one
Mhm.
must need to be in order to walk with someone into that trauma at just the right pace and to just the right depth, given
Mhm.
where they're at in that moment.
I liken it to uh, taking a child into a basement that they're afraid of.
Mm,
Right. And so the bottom of the basement is where the fear is, but everything leading down that staircase is anxious, provoking. It causes more anxiety. And so I think about each step, taking it very methodically and, doing distress tolerance. And sometimes people can go 3 steps down. Sometimes a person can only go 1 step in, and then we talk about the level of distress that they're feeling, and we're trying to reduce that in an
mhm.
attempt to help them cope with whatever trauma they have been experiencing.
So yeah, on the note of coping now, when you do have someone in a situation where the sort of cause of the trauma is kind of perpetual, like
Mhm,
your example of the Black Lives Matter movement or people in domestic violence situations, it's a great example. And so what do you do then when
mhm, mhm.
yeah, like it's just like the cause has not been removed yet.
Right. And so this is just about really validating their experience,
Mhm.
right? So a lot of times when someone is dealing with trauma or a difficult situation, they feel like it's only them. And then the second thought is that, this could be my fault if only I improved the way I presented, or if only I corrected something. And so by validating their experience, you're really giving them strength and a release from the distress that they're feeling.
Mm,
And in therapy, that is one of the most important things that you can do with a client, is just validating them. And in that, sometimes people, will come up with new ways of approaching a situation because they have had that release. And so ultimately, therapy, as you know, is not about me fixing, anyone. And so I get a lot of clients who become frustrated and they're like, just tell me what to do. And I often tell them, you know that that's not what this is about. I'm here to support you on your own journey. And part of that is me believing that everyone has the answers to their own healing within them. And so I am just asking poignant questions to help you get there. And so when I do that, it's a tussle within oneself about what it is they truly desire. And sometimes it may look like, I do not want to leave my partner. I want to adjust the way this relationship, the way we interact with each other, or reduce the harmful outcomes that come of our interactions, where other people are like, I need to get out and I need to find a safe way to do it because I think I deserve better, or I know that this person will not change. And
mm,
so leading a person to help them make their own decision kind of starts with just like leaving space in the room for them and assuring that person that you're strong enough to hold whatever they have, because a
mm,
lot of social nuance and like um, courtesy is that when someone asks you, are you having a good day, the response is, yeah, I'm okay, even if you're not, because you don't want to put that on someone.
mm,
But in therapy, this is a place where you can put that down and give it to me to hold, even if for an hour. So if you can imagine you're carrying a 50-pound sack all day and someone's like, I'll carry it for you for an hour. Can you
Mm,
imagine the release
mm.
that, you know, how good that feels?
Beautiful analogy. Yes.
So,
Mm. So, so talk to me about the importance of being able to relate to your client's experience on a personal, direct level. Like you said, you specialize in working with women of color, and you are a woman of color. And I imagine that you offered a level of empathy that just someone like me, a male, Caucasian male, just simply could not reach. So, can you just talk to me about the importance of that?
well, I think that everyone has the opportunity to reach the level of empathy. And so I don't think that I need to specifically match, right? So I
Mm,
do specialize in women of color, but some of my practice is full of men. And I think it's about, some of the tenets of psychology, like genuine positive regard for your
mhm,
client. And, in that, it is about taking the time to just understand how they interpret the world and how they interpret their experiences. And that is me not only listening, but observing, bodily responses to some of the information they're sharing that may give me, insight into is this, a really comfortable um, topic that they're sharing, or is there some anxiousness or distress that they're feeling? And if they're willing to share that with me, allow them to. And so I have had clients who have very similar experiences to me walking in this world, but then I've had clients who have completely different and so experiences than me. And it's about the space that I afford them. We are working together in therapy. And so I like to think of it as a relationship where you are sharing with me and I'm getting to know you through questions and through conversation and through support. And yes, my response and the information that I give and my conceptualization of cases is grounded in, evidence-based theories and evidence-based best practices. But, at the end of the day, I'm just offering another human, a non-judgmental space to share what's going on with them.
mm,
And I think that's really invaluable because in so many spaces, we're used to having to perform under judgment, right? Whether it's work, home, with family. I mean, in every space, we are required to, live up to some social norm. And although I expect all my clients to be respectful towards
sure.
me,
And to wear
um,
clothes.
right, right, I do allow them, space to use whatever language that
Mm,
they want to use to express their feelings and, to really be who they are and examine why maybe they feel like they can't be that person in other spaces or, what are some of the boundaries or lack of boundaries that cause them this distress where they may feel like this is the only safe space for them to share what they have going on.
mm. Beautiful answer. And I think that's really useful for, for anyone listening who is a therapist or wants to become a therapist in thinking about, to what degree can I support someone who is from a completely different cultural background with totally different norms and rituals, and it sounds like you're saying you can still support them to a very significant degree. And although you might not have shared experiences with them, that raw empathy can still be there with just emotional mirroring and kind of just that, like you said, listening deeply, holding space, asking good questions, seeking to understand them without judgment. Yeah, that's encouraging. And then I also see I can think of like literally three people I know who are women of color who sought out a woman of color to be their therapist. So I do think that there are many people who feel the need to seek a therapist who really has had a direct, like, can directly relate to their experience. So I see the value in that too.
Mhm.
Hmm.
I definitely think, right, there is a real value, right? So um, if I have to teach someone, right, let's say I go to a white male, hetero, cisgendered, therapist, and I have to teach him about some of the nuances
Mm,
of my culture, that is taking away from my time that I need to let my bags down. And
right.
so finding someone that's some of the shortcuts that we, find is
Mm,
like, if someone looks like me, maybe then they understand what it's like to experience systemic racism in the world and how
yes.
that's impacting my workplace and the stress that I have at my job. And then we could just kind of speed past that where I don't have to like give a lot of time to explain that to them. And so then we can actually get down to how do I deal with that on a day-to-day basis?
Mm,
How do I deal with being the only Black person in the room at work and people wanting me to teach them about,
mm,
you know, what it is to be a Black person or
right.
a person of color. And so I definitely understand the need to have people who look like you and support you in that way. And so, yes, I
It's a
get what.
great way to put it. The shortcuts, you can speed past having to explain what it's like to be me. That makes perfect sense. And I think, one of the concepts that's been very helpful that has emerged somewhat recently is just the concept of intersectionality of identity. Um, because, it's one thing, for example, to be gay.
Mhm,
It's one thing to be a woman. It's one
mhm,
thing to be a Black person. And it's quite another thing to be the combination of all three. And so
mhm,
that's, just for people listening, that's the idea of intersectionality, is that we all have different facets of our identity that intersect in interesting ways. And when we have this kind of certain combinations of intersecting identities, it really gives rise to a very unique experience in the world
mhm,
that, someone who is Black but a heterosexual male might not fully be able to relate to.
mhm.
So yeah, I think when you kind of are meeting with someone who shares multiple facets of your identity and how they intersect, I imagine there's just this, yeah, it's just the ultimate shortcut to
Yeah,
understanding where you're coming from.
absolutely. So intersectionality was coined by the psychologist who wrote either in the Chicago Law or Harvard Law Review. And what she said was is um, that a lot of intersectionality was removed for Black women because people would be like, well, there are Black men in this workplace, so racism can't exist. And then there are women in this workplace, so, gender bias can't exist.
Mm,
But the intersectionality of being a Black woman is very unique. And so it says that, like, even though someone, people can have multiple identities, but that intersection of those multiple identities does not necessarily make them safe from
mm,
bias in, workplace or communities. And so someone who may be a white, gay male, yes, he does have the privilege of being white, but he's also, can be, discriminated against because of his sexuality and can
right.
be ousted because of that. And just because you have, white men working in this, space that are not discriminated against are, there may be gay people who are discriminated against.
Right.
And so when you think about all the, identities that we have now, even more than ever in the
Hmm.
past, right? Are we creating safe spaces for people who have these multiple identities? And
Mm,
um, is it supported or are we overlooking it, right?
mm,
And so one of the big arguments that is going on is like the term people of color, where it's like, yes, we have a lot of people of color in our workspace, And so does that mean that you have Asian people of multiple ethnicities? I think there's like 25 to 30 ethnic groups, Asian ethnic groups. And yes, they are people of color. But then if you only have one Black person, does that Black person feel included? Is it an inclusive, workspace for that person? Or if we have, a Latina, is she included in that workspace, or
Mm.
does she feel alienated in some way? And so intersectionality and finding the right therapist and feeling safe in therapy do all matter.
Mm. Beautiful. I've noticed this interesting, I guess, pushback against the idea of safe spaces.
Mhm.
For example, there's an influential book that came out recently called The Coddling of the American Mind by the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt. And I read it, and he makes many good points. And I think um, in some cases, people interpret someone challenging their intellectual ideas as
Mhm.
being somehow threatening. And so I see the point about how we shouldn't coddle people in terms of challenging them intellectually and things like that. But I also think that some people are becoming a bit dismissive of the notion of safe spaces without fully understanding what we mean by that, and without fully understanding what it might be like to feel isolated, alienated, or somehow invalidated in a
Mhm.
social setting. And I think that one of the forms that um, discrimination takes nowadays can be
Mhm.
described as like discrimination through 1,000 condescending cuts, just like
Mhm.
little tiny things every day
Yeah.
that just affect you very negatively. Like some people don't know what it's like to be subtly condescended.
Mhm.
And
That is
and if
very
they were to
true.
experience that, they would be extremely offended, because typically these are people who find a lot of self-worth in their own, how the world receives them, right? And so if they were to experience any amount of condescension, they would be very offended. And I find that it's actually these types of people who are dismissing the idea of safe spaces and things like that. So so
I think
yeah.
that if you can't imagine a world where you have not been safe, then you do not understand the importance of safe spaces. And I
Mm,
think that it is um, maybe I do think that some of it is intentional, but I think that if you truly cannot imagine a world where you are a unique individual and you are safe, everything about you is safe to the world, then you cannot imagine what it's like for someone to say to you when you are in a boardroom, oh, you speak so well. To you who is safe, that may be like, that's a compliment.
right.
And to the person who is, on the outside of that safety is like, well, is it? Why wouldn't I speak well? And what does that mean? And what value are you attributing to someone who speaks well? If I didn't speak well, would that still imply that I was less than? I mean, and so all of these, nuanced conversations, occur that I think people don't understand, even able-bodied people versus people who are differently abled, right? And so it's like, yeah, it's just around the corner, but what does that mean for me, versus what does that mean for someone else? And am I othering them in that statement, simply because I do not know what it is like to be differently abled? And so when we think about like people who minimize, safe spaces, I wonder if they have ever had an example where they were the only in any situation and felt unsafe.
Right.
Mhm.
Great point. That's it. So I feel like you've spoken to the kind of three major dimensions of an individual: the biological, the psychological, and the environmental, in a really nice way here. And I love that term, like biopsychosocial organisms. I think that's a really nice, well-rounded description of a human being. And so, just to kind of recap a little bit and then ask you to elaborate, the biological, I think what you do and what you said about the medical mirroring of depression and anxiety, by making sure people's depression and anxiety is not stemming from an actual physical disease or condition, that's crucial. And I would just add to this that, when we think of, for example, like the hierarchy of needs, and we see that at the bottom are our survival needs or biological needs, it's one thing to kind of meet that need. In other words, it's one thing to not be starving, but it's
Mhm.
quite another to be sufficiently nourished. It's quite another for your brain to have everything that it really needs to function optimally. And so I just think that this is something that people can invest some energy into, is just optimizing their biology and
Mhm.
noticing how much that will affect their emotional stability and their cognitive clarity. Because again, it's not enough to simply eat enough calories every day. It's We really should put more effort into optimizing our nutrients.
Absolutely. And so this is where like issues of systemic racism and, privilege and power come into play because we have people who live in food deserts. And so if all of your nutrients are coming from canned goods, prepackaged foods, are you working optimally? Is your brain, is your endocrine system, are they functioning optimally when you're not eating anything that's alive, right? Like
Mm,
fruits and vegetables and things like that. And then we think about how those communities were built and developed, related to redlining and related to,
yes.
school funding and things like that. And so do we understand that even at the root of becoming a whole and healthy person, as you say, like being fully nourished, do you have the resources to achieve that? And if you don't, how does that play out into your mental health? How does that
Mm,
play out into how you live in the world and, noticing that you don't have the resources? Um,
mm,
I think I remember I was, living and working in Atlanta, and I I am as intentional in eating, an apple a day. And so I did not bring an apple with me, and I had to go to the store and get one. And this is not like Whole Foods or anything, but I like that type of apples that I like. And it was $1.39 for
wow.
this one apple. And when you think about $1.39, this apple is not going to fulfill, like it's not going to satiate me if I'm really hungry,
Right.
right? It kind of felt like a luxury considering I could buy a burger from McDonald's. I could buy multiple bags of chips. I could buy candy bars, right? All of these things that may be filling but aren't um, optimizing my health.
Mm,
And so we think about how all of that impacts our mental health. We think about the consumption of social media. We think about the consumption, the availability of sleep, of course, nutrition, of course, access to exercise. All of these things are things that we know research has shown optimizes mental health,
mm,
but not everyone has equal access to. And so those are also some of the areas that I address in, therapy when working with clients, because sometimes you cannot see the forest through the trees, right? Or however that saying goes. And so me even pointing out like a simple thing that someone can do who does not have the money to afford a gym membership, but knows that working out improves their mental health is like, hey, here are some things that other people have used, or here are some areas, communities that are safe to exercise in, right? That you have access to, that you won't feel alienated. And so all of those things go into me helping a client meet their mental health goals.
such a great point, because as hard as it may be to believe, there are many people who deny that there is systemic racism. And I mean, to me, that's absurd.
Mhm.
And it's really interesting. I have like a pretty unique family because my grandparents adopted six kids. And so they gave birth to my mom and they adopted six other kids. And ethnically and in many other ways, they're quite diverse on that side of the family. So I feel like that was really good for me as a person to have family, not just friends, but family, like who are Black, who are Mexican, who are Native American, because of many reasons, because it just helped me like grow out of certain silly ideas. Like, for
Yeah.
example, and I'm going to make myself sound kind of a dumb right now, or at least I was dumb in this phase, but I'm willing to admit it. I have an aunt and she's Japanese. And I remember I was like, as embarrassing as it is to admit that I was a freshman in college and I was writing a paper for a class. And I don't know what my main point really was. Hopefully, it wasn't as silly as what it sounds like right now. But basically, I was like trying to say, like, race doesn't really matter. What matters more is like class and things like that. And I was sharing this with my aunt, and she just looked at me point blank and she was like, "Oh, well, it does matter."
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
it was just really important that I heard that as bluntly as that from my kin, from a family member who's grown up with me, who's almost helped raise me. And so I feel like I've had that privilege of being awakened to things that some people might take a lot longer to awaken to. So anyway, people who are on that track and don't have people kind of pointing out specific examples of systemic racism, they actually deny it. Um,
And so
so,
I actually think that's a really nuanced way, right? And of course, there are multiple levels, but I think that when we think about it, this country may not want to identify as racist, but classism is still acceptable,
mm,
right? And so if you create all these hurdles for people based on race, and then you create a class system, it looks like class
mm,
versus race. But those things are so highly correlated because of the historical, building of foundational things like banking and, home ownership and, military benefits and things like that that were created for all Americans to achieve like the American dream, but were withheld from certain people saying, well, it's available to everyone. Why haven't you achieved it yet? But not looking at the historical reasons why. And so,
right.
yes, I've definitely debated with people like, yes, I think that there is more focus on classism because we do see, people of all races, ethnicities, genders, and sexualities achieve riches in this
Mm,
country, but are they the exception or are they the rule is the question. And then if they are the exception, why are they the exception and how does
mm,
that impact other people who look like them,
mm,
right? Are they
yes.
used as a ruler to say, well, Michael Jordan made it, why can't you make it, right? or
Right.
are they used like, yeah, Michael Jordan made it, but look at all of us great athletes who
Mm,
haven't made it. And so I definitely think that this issue is so complicated, and the way that it plays out in the mental health of clients is just as complicated
mm,
because people do question, um, why am I, a married Black woman who's struggling where my peers, who may be white or Asian or Latinx don't seem to be struggling as much. Or, there is, the gamut of like, Asian women making 104% to a white man's dollar, all the way down to Latinx women making 68 cents.
mm,
And what does that look like in your life when you're paying bills, buying a home, living the American dream, and how much harder you have to work for it? And why does it appear easier for other people? Because a lot of times people then internalize that and they forget all the other reasons why it may actually be easier for someone, and it's just not, the optics of it.
Right.
And do you internalize this as a fault that then cycles into depression or anxiety? Or do you take a moment to say, hey, let me work through this and understand the historical and, all the other factors that meld into this and create my own kind of like a measure of success.
Mm, beautifully said. And I was going to ask you, yeah, like, how do you work with a client as complex as it is, who has kind of internalized this as a fault, as you said? Um, and I feel like you just explained that beautifully. But maybe is there anything else you can say about working with people who have kind of had to survive against all these counter
Yeah,
pressures?
I always, when working with clients, I first, try to do an assessment of their boundaries. And then I try to do an assessment of internalized negative views of
Mm,
their race, gender, or sexuality, and really examine how that may be playing into any depression or anxiety that they may feel, and how possibly addressing that and being aware of that can help reduce the distress that they feel. I mean, I can't tell you how many times that I've worked with women of color who are dealing with a lot of anxiety and depression because they had resources and they feel like they didn't deserve having resources.
mm,
And when I mean having resources, that simply means that they had food on the table, came from a two-parent home, and never worried about whether the lights were going to be on or if they were going to have enough to eat or if they could get shoes and clothes when they outgrew them or they became, too distressed to wear. And if that is the thing that is causing you distress, then what is the internalized belief around that? Is the internalized belief that people of color should struggle and that is their lot in life? And if that is the internalized belief, then who does that serve? Right. And so is that serving you? Is that preventing you from growing and moving forward and becoming more successful? Or is that, putting hurdles in your way where then you kind of like self-sabotage? And does that cause depression and anxiety? And so I definitely try to look at a holistic view of all the social ills, I guess to say, that impact our mental health.
mm,
Because now more than ever, with our access, right, we have so much access to information, but that also is sharing some of the internalized and systemic messages that we have received, um, like fourfold. And so I definitely challenge my clients to think about that on their mental health journey as well.
mm.
I know it's so much, right?
Yeah, but I mean, you clearly have like a clear understanding of how to help people through all of these complexities. And again, it's like this is a good example of the psychological domain of helping people. There's trauma, which is related to psychological, and then there's all these internalized messages, which is related to the psychological. And then when it comes to the environmental, the social factor, when a person is in circumstances that are continuously traumatizing, like you said, the best you can hope for, I suppose, is to adopt effective coping strategies. But if you kind of start to think about it like super big picture, what what is your vision of? Let me ask you this question: what is your vision of the closest thing to utopia as we could possibly reach? Like, what is best case scenario for our
Mhm,
relatively near future? Let's say less than 50 years,
mhm,
our lifetime. What is your vision for best case scenario, and how do you think we can get there?
Ooh, I don't know, but I think that my best case scenario for all my clients is for them to be free and
Mm,
whatever that looks like for them, right? Freedom for me may look different than freedom for you and freedom for someone else. And so, in that freedom, I think it's kind of like links us to our power source where when you're free, things are achievable. You believe that things are achievable. There aren't these glass walls that prevent you from like achieving things that you want that other people can't see or can't explain, but you know are there, right? And so um, I've heard people, say that, once we're all blended into a nice brown color, there will be no more but I actually don't think that. I think that the diversity of America is unique. And I think that the diversity is what will really ultimately save us and
mm,
continue to propel us to achieve kind of greatness. And so
mm,
having multiple perspectives and space for multiple perspectives and people owning when they, feel embarrassed or uncomfortable because of the multiple perspectives and learning and growing from that is how we are going to achieve our best selves and society ultimately, I think.
yes.
And so having everyone just be open to learning and to being free is really what I
Mm,
hope.
amen. That's beautiful. I'm with you wholeheartedly on that.
Yeah.
And on that note of like the potential of becoming this sort of almost undifferentiated,
Mhm.
bland, similar group.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point that like we have what so rampantly in the world and in this country, the us versus them
Mhm.
mentality. And I don't think that the solution to that is to just kind of think of everyone as the same as each other. That would just kind of rob us of the richness of diversity. And rather, I think the key is to replace the word versus with the
Mhm.
word and to have like an us and them mentality where we recognize and celebrate differences in our perspectives and our background and our up everything, and at the same time not feel that that pits us against each other. And
Mhm.
I think that's I think of the word harmony, like a choir is made of a bunch of people who have different specialties. It's not like everyone sings at the same octave and the same note. It's like a harmony of specialists, of distinct individuals and distinct subgroups that make for beautiful music. And I think that's kind of a good analogy for what our society can be like, is like a harmony of highly differentiated individuals and subgroups, but that are connected to each other and harmonized with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the them and us. Yes,
Mm.
absolutely. Yeah. Thanks.
Mm. I asked for an hour of your time and you've given me more than that. And this has been such a thought provoking, interesting, helpful conversation.
It has
So,
been great.
yeah, thank you so much for joining me and sharing your experience and your understanding. And thank you for the work that you do.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a great experience.
Are you accepting clients currently?
Yes. So my mental health group practice is accepting clients, and we have clinicians who focus on treating people of all ethnicities with cultural, sensitivity and
Mm,
awareness.
mm. Where can we find that group?
Yes. My website is ipassinc.net. So it's ipassinc.net.
Excellent. And I did look at this website, and so you work with a group of other therapists, right? And you've kind of formed a coalition.
Yes. Yes.
Beautiful.
where our goal is to provide quality mental health to people of color and marginalized genders. And so we definitely focus on creating that space, and we do a lot of consultations that all of our clinicians are aware of what they're bringing into the room with clients in order to create a safe space for all of our clients.
Beautiful. Well, I'll put that website and a link in the description, and hopefully I'm sure there's someone out there that wants to seek your support given everything they just heard from you. So I hope we stay connected, and
Yeah.
this has been great.
All right.
Take care.
If you like this video and you want to see more, please subscribe.